Welcome to the American Anti-Corruption Institute's series on fraud and corruption. My name is Elbert Files. I'm president of the American Anti-Corruption Institute. And I'd like to welcome today the Right Honorable Bruce George, a master in electoral fraud and corruption, not only in the UK, but over 100 countries around the world as an electoral observer. Thank you and welcome, Bruce. Tell me a little bit about your first experience. You were 36 years member of the House of Parliament and an election monitor. Let's start with your very first election.
My first election was a disaster. I expected it to be because I frankly didn't want to win. The constituency I stood in was not to my liking, but it was experience. The trade unions run the Labour Party, always have done and probably always will. But they slipped up in my case and I won an election. I was selected because they didn't put a candidate. If they had, he would have won because that's how the Labour Party operates. So I slipped through the system. But anybody who runs against a trade union in British politics, if they're Labour, makes a big mistake because the trade unions, which I idolize, it's so important to have trade unions. But what I don't like about British trade unions is that in the Labour Party, they control the Labour Party. And I frankly don't like that.
So your very first election
was a disaster.
Disaster, and there was mischief afoot in the election.
Well, I didn't mind losing. It was just experience. And I knew, however competent I thought I was, I knew it would take some time. Because if you didn't have the support of the trade unions, it would be very difficult to win an election. As I said, I slipped through the system because they didn't think Walsall South was winnable. But once I was there, and the unions, I supported the unions because that's the only way you operate in British politics.
Bruce, tell me about your experiences running for office. You stood for how many elections over 36 years?
9.
9?
And 9 wins. My only regret in life, 10 would have been much easier. And for all sorts of reasons I don't want to go into. I don't want to criticize my successor. But 10 is neater. But I quit. After 9, I'd had enough, and I thought I have other things to do. Mainly, all I was doing before that, without the tedium of having to grovel to the trade unions. And I have been studying, writing, lecturing, having a wonderful, wonderful time. And do I have any regrets about not being a member of Parliament? Not the slightest.
It seems a tenet of life in the West that one man, one vote is an absolute right. Why do we cling to that idea, and how do we abuse it?
We cling to the idea because it is the only way democracy can operate. Unfortunately, not all countries in the world are as honest as the UK is, and I must add, we're not particularly honest. It's a question of we are less crooked in the UK than most other countries. So I have become very cynical in my long, long career. And I was very fortunate that Parliament was very happy, for various reasons, to fund my foreign travels. So it meant I probably visited over 100 countries. Most of them were crooked as hell. I never accused them of being crooked because you'd end up face on the ground if you were lucky. But I was able to talk to people, to get their views, to recall exactly what I heard, and that produced in my mind this concept that the whole world is corrupt. It is just a question of degrees of corruption. Some countries are endemically, totally corrupt. They kill their opponents. No, we haven't done that for about 300 years in the UK. I'm not quite certain about the US. But you do, if you are a student of politics and government, then it is impossible to emerge from that lengthy process, as I have done, without being very, very contemptuous of politicians throughout the world. I would not accuse all of them. There are very many absolutely honest men and women of the greatest, what word can I use, integrity. But they are grossly outnumbered by those who have no principles other than making a vast amount of money and supporting a corrupt regime, or participating in a regime, or running a crooked regime. And the numbers are endless.
What mischief in elections have you seen here? What did you experience?
Well, when people talk about corruption, they often simply consider the national government and whether it is corrupt. What must be understood is that there are many layers of government, right down to the meanest, smallest entity in that country. And you have to look farther down the list, looking for levels of corruption. So it is a big mistake simply to criticize a national government. You have to analyze the political, economic system of that country, and you will find layers of corruption which can be as devastating as just what the national government does. But the national government sets the scene. If the national government is corrupt, then it just spreads down.
In the past, there's been the philosophy, if you will, that to be a right and fit voter, you have to have a certain amount of, if you will, skin in the game, where a voter has a certain relationship to the outcome, such as property ownership or something similar like that. Do you think that helps, hurts?
Well, if you're a Democrat, it hurts. But I think what one has to do is to make your analysis based on the country and the period in which that country was operating. And one must accept the fact that democracy, in theory, goes back to the ancient Greeks, but it wasn't really democracy. It was if you were wealthy. If you were not, if you were a slave, you were trash. So you have to look at the timing. And democracy is fairly modern. Before that, the standards were almost non-existent, other than corrupt. There was no democracy. People who held power were often evil, and they made vast fortunes until another group of people took over and probably killed them or forced them into exile. So anybody, in my view, perhaps I'm a little bit perverse in my view, but I have been studying the subject now for, before you were born, and perhaps that
Flattery gets
and that does give you an awful perspective, and perhaps it's unfair, but I'm convinced I'm right, because having been to all of these countries, and when you meet these leaders, they are seemingly very normal people, but they are abnormal because in the countries I have visited throughout the world, these nice men, men, because women rarely, until recently, have a chance of getting anywhere in a political system. Even Joan of Arc, the English killed centuries and centuries ago. So now one of the greatest things that has happened in politics is the growing strength of powerful women, and long may that remain. So politics is complicated, it does differ, but now we have a lot of countries that are genuinely democratic, but you must not assume that democracy means perfection. It means that it has a lower degree of, a greater degree of, and awareness of corruption, but it is there almost everywhere. I'm not accusing everybody. So many of my friends in politics are men and women of great integrity. But even in democracies, there are degrees of corruption. And I said, and all the way down the system. And that has to be countered as best we can. But what chance have we got in countering corruption in countries which have been bred on corruption?
As you understand, democracy is truly a Western concept. Are we in the West forcing the idea of one man, one vote onto cultures where they just may not be ready for it?
We'd like to put pressure on them, but we have little influence over them. We have a difficult enough job to maintain democracy in countries purporting to be democratic. If you look at, and there are so many books, many of which I have in my enormous library in my homes, one in my former constituency and one in London, and you can, you can just see and smell the stink of corruption in so many of those countries. I said I've been to over 100 of them. I've survived because I wasn't difficult to them, and smiled, and they smiled, and these leaders looked very normal men, but they were not. Many of them were killers, and anybody who sought to oppose them had a short life expectation. So will democracy spread throughout the world? Well, not in my lifetime. Maybe it will, but I very much doubt it. Corruption and autocracy is so much easier than running a democracy where you actually lose elections. Can you believe it? When you talk to these people and you say, well, Mr. George, were you a minister? No, I was just a backbencher. And they can't believe that you can lose an election. And the Labour Party has lost quite a few, but not me. I always survived. I survived because I did not say, as many members of Parliament say, I look after my own. The people who vote for me are the people I support. As far as I'm concerned, I didn't give a damn. And I remember knocking on one door 7 or 8 years ago, and I didn't say who I was, but most people knew who I was. And I said, I hope, I'm calling on behalf of the Labour Party, I hope you vote Labour. And this guy said, I'm not voting Labour. I thought, damn. He said, I'm not voting Labour, I'm voting for you. And that's how I survived. I did not ask people, as many people do, even in democracies, who do you vote for? It's not my job. My job is to serve the 50,000 constituents, whatever, in my constituency.
That reminds me of something a former Speaker of the U.S. House used to say, Tip O'Neill. He said, all politics is local.
Partly true.
Bruce, does it strike you as a conflict of interest where the establishment the people who are in office actually run the election for the replacements?
It's a difficult question to answer, because in a genuine democracy, and there are some, they recognize the fact that there's a strength in parties losing an election. Now, it sounds perverse, but parties can run out of not just of time, but of what to do. And the leadership can get bored, can get old, and be out of it. And so that party that loses an election, it's almost doing them a favor, perverse though it seems, because it means a new generation who have been middle-ranking politicians can then move up into a higher level. And the party that loses has time to repair, to find new people, to have new ideas. And that's what the democratic process is. You win and you lose. And when you lose, you take your beating and use that period to win, if you can, the next election. But if you are stupid, and I can recall a number of parties that have been seriously stupid, they don't take that advice seriously, and they run policies that are aimed at a tiny percentage of the population, often if they are left-wing, and they lose their own potential supporters, who then might go off and form another political party. So it is deeply stupid to just look at a percentage of the population and think you can get away and win an election.
I was thinking more of the establishment running the elections so that the establishment remains the establishment.
Well, then that would be corrupt. And there is corruption even in democracies. But very often the public suss that out, and they see, because the media, which tends to be in the UK on the right wing, not all, but they are often actually quite honest. And people who read newspapers and watch television will have a pretty good idea as to who is making money, who has no right to make that money, who is being competent and incompetent. And I think the party leadership would spot that pretty damn easily too. And you would work it out. I have in the past forgotten now. You know, the life expectancy of a minister, can be very, very short. So you can never be excessively overconfident about your tenure, because your tenure could be 6 months, maybe a couple of years. But in a democratic system, as we have in the UK, the chances are you're going to lose an election. Now, it does appear there have been times when the political parties have been so oblivious of reality that they have carried on, and then found the end is nigh, and then, folks, it's too late.
What is the path that a misguided government would take to disenfranchise a voter? Not saying disenfranchise is in preventing them to vote, but the voter becomes so apathetic they're disenfranchised.
Well, I'm sure some do that, try that, and bore people to death. But it's a short-term tactic. In a corrupt world, which I said is most of the world, they are perfectly happy to have a population that takes no interest whatsoever in politics. And why? Because their role in that political system is zero. But even in those corrupt countries, there are honest people who want to see a different country, a more open country, a country where more people can participate in the political process. And fortunately, in my view, this is in a majority of countries. And if you push the regime too far, mate, you know, you're down for the chop. And there are many countries where that happens. I can mention numerous ones where your survival, it may not be an ostentatious killing, but I can name a number of countries in Europe where people disappear or people die in very, very, very obvious circumstances. And it's happened in my country where people actually come from abroad, do a hit, and then clear off and are never found again because they are protected by the countries who sent the killers to do the job. So even going to a democracy from an autocracy is no guarantee of your security. So brave men and women have died because of their principles.
If the voter is disenfranchised, that they feel that their vote is no longer worth them casting, does it make sense for them to sell their vote, their absentee ballot, their mail-in ballot for $50 or $100?
Well, it sounds perverse my saying this, but if the system is so corrupt and there's nothing you can do about it, then I can understand why, if you are poor, and many people in these countries are very, very poor, I can understand why they would want to take some money. It's not very a moral thing to do, but you're talking about immoral countries.
You've had some amazing experiences. As an election monitor, can you please tell me what you experienced in Ukraine and then Georgia?
I have an enormous admiration for the people of Ukraine, who have suffered over the centuries from the most evil regimes. But there have been periods in Ukraine and in Georgia and in many countries where that rule of the evil is broken. And the countries have gone through a period of democracy. And I've been to many of these countries. I've offered them advice. It is often taken. And I have loved going to countries like Ukraine and Georgia. Rather a paradox in a way, being named Georgia, loving Georgia. But it's very difficult to sustain your democracy because the evil ones who might have been booted out don't just say, okay, folks, thank you very much, we're off now, you carry on with your democracy. It doesn't often happen. They are still around, they are still perverse, they are still building up their support, and when the time comes, bang, they're back in. It could happen, and some of the countries I've mentioned have been accused of this, where an honest politician who runs an honest regime can turn a little bit, what phrase can I use, crooked. And that has happened. But you can never, ever tell because the propaganda machines of the opposition who wish to become the government can be so very, very strong that the relatively or very honest leader, president, whatever role you think, then the public opinion actually believes some of the nonsense that they are told. So you can never be absolutely certain when you're looking at a foreign country of what is true and what is untrue. The best thing you could do is to, if you trust your representatives, the people who are in that country on behalf of your country, and if they are honest, then they are far more likely to give a better and more honest picture of political reality than you would find from the locals.
What did you see in the Georgian election for you to come back and say, there's a big problem?
Yeah. Well, if you, it sounds rather pompous. I don't think I am pompous, but I've been to so many elections and so many countries. I have become quite competent in making reasonably intelligent judgments, especially if before you go to a country, you do all of the research that is necessary. You go along to your embassy, almost the first point of call when you go to that country, and you get a fuller picture. And so the combination of reading books, of talking to people before you go, of talking to people you would trust when you were there, you end up with a pretty damn good analysis of corruption or non-corruption. I mean, non-corruption is a fantasy. It's a question of degrees of corruption. Even in my country, is everything honest and above board? Like hell, it's not. But it's a question. It's there somewhere, and I'm sure somebody has worked this out. You know, where does just playing a little bit dirty still allow you to be seen as a genuine democracy? But the point you go beyond that point, and you can see the country is purporting to be a democracy, but it is a degree of autocracy or even, and that word isn't used anymore, totalitarian. I think North Korea would fit into that. Others, well, authoritarian.
Being very specific, what were the anomalies? What were the things that stood out that you saw or experienced in Georgia for you to go, this is not right?
Yeah. Well, if you've been around as long as I have, going around the world, looking at elections and corruption, and if you talk to people and you read the books or write the books, in some cases, then you know when you go there, if you go to a country oblivious of whether it is a democracy, then you're wasting whoever's paying your trip. So the only way to do it properly is to be very, very well prepared. Now, I have been going back and forth everywhere over the period of 40 years. And so I only have to look at my own notebooks or what I've written to say what it was historically and what it is now. So I don't purport to be the world expert, but if you've been to as many crooked countries as I have, you know what a crooked country is. And when you meet the leaders, I mean, they're usually absolutely delightful to foreigners. Now, the moment you go through the door out, they would metamorphosize to what they really are. In some cases, killers. But they don't have the word killer on their foreheads because they are people, the fact they are in power means they have very considerable skills. And those skills can overwhelm anybody who is naive into thinking what a wonderful country this is. I remember going to one country, I won't say where, the leader was a delight. I was with him for 2 hours and we talked, and I I said, oh, look, Mr. President, you are very, very popular. You keep winning elections. Why, forgive me for saying this, but, you won the last election with no opposition. You had competition, but they didn't get any votes. I said, you're so loved in your country. Why don't you let the opposition, wherever it is, win, let's say, 20 seats out of the 300? Ah, Brucey said, that's very, very wise of you. I'll really think hard about this. And I thought, hey, George, hey, you've made a little bit of progress there. But I'm bloody sure the moment I walked through the door, he probably said, this idiot. If he thinks I'm going to change the way I run my country, he must be mad. And frankly, I was. I wasn't suggesting he became the head of a democracy, but just allowed some people who didn't particularly like him to be able to vote without being killed. So I've seen it all. I have seen it almost all.
Can a small amount of fraud make that big deal in an election? In short, can we tolerate a little fraud in an election, like a little loss from a stock register?
Yeah. Well, we have to, because fraud is everywhere. I said even the Pope kicked out a few of his cardinals because he thought they were not playing the game as he wanted. I'm very proud of being British. I'm so happy I was born in Wales, and I was a member of Parliament for so long. I'm very proud of my country, Great Britain, and I've seen it decline in my lifetime. But it is reasonably democratic, and reasonably the politicians are men and now women of integrity. But the system of democracy tolerates, encourages corruption. They wouldn't admit it, but corruption is absolutely everywhere. Now, governments have got to find out where that corruption is, or the agencies of the state, which may not be completely controlled by government, have an obligation to chase these crooks and put them where they deserve to be. In the UK, it is happening. It is happening. Is it happening enough? The answer is no.
I'm intrigued by several elections I've seen, both in the United States and the UK, that were won by just a few hundred votes. And I can imagine that the invitation to mischief in the close elections is even greater. And I'll read you the little story I clipped out of the news. A Margarita del Pilar became a permanent legal resident of the United States in 2004. She promptly applied for an Illinois driver's license and registered to vote at the same time, then cast a ballot in the 2006 congressional elections. When she applied for naturalization in 2007, she admitted that she had voted in an American election. Of course, if she had not applied to become a citizen, she could have continued to vote illegally with almost no chance of being detected. Is this case of this Peruvian woman just another example of how easy it is for non-citizens to vote in elections? Are there apparently some politicians who want to ensure that they continue to do so without getting caught?
I think you're right. I mean, I have read the story of this lady, and when I think of the corruption in the United States, I see this as almost trivial. There is far more corruption, that I would just laugh at this story and say she's almost did the right thing, but not quite. I can think of, there must be hundreds of thousands of people who have done infinitely worse than she did. She was almost a citizen, and she has had a bad time as a result of getting caught by, I would have thought, a triviality. I think the US should do far more to find out who the real crooks are in their society, and it can be pretty high up, but I must say, I love your country, I'm married to one of its citizens, but I would just hope that the greatest democracy in the world, by far the United States, would do infinitely more to clear the rubbish out of their political system. But I don't think any president would have the power to do that, because there are too many who are quite happy to maintain the current status quo.
So when you look at subverting an election, what is the purpose behind it? Is the purpose money? Is it ideology? What are the purposes behind subverting a vote?
Everything.
Everything.
Even if it wasn't money, it is just power. There are people who just want power. The power to kill, the power to do what you gain from, or the thrill of being top of the heap. There's a whole bundle of reasons, and in some cases they're all combined into one person. I said I have been and met so many of these people over the years, and they are seemingly, genuinely human beings and very nice people. But you know, the moment you walk out of the door, they probably say, keep this man out, I don't want to see him again. And I've been to so many countries which are totally rotten and corrupt. And it's rather perverse to like going around those countries. But you have to go around these countries actually to know how the political system works throughout the world. And it makes you very, very skeptical about politics and politicians, I must add. I know a lot of politicians who are absolutely almost absolutely decent men, and thankfully more women. But I'm afraid, in my view, they're a minority.
What over the years, in the true saturation of your deeds of seeing elections, monitoring elections, what has caused you the most outrage?
I must confess that although I'm outraged by almost every election I've ever been to, you know, if you want to stay sane, you can't be too outrageous, at least until you get beyond the border of the country that you have just visited. And then you might want to go there again. So one has to be sensible about these things and say, this is what the world is.
But what was the seminal event? One that was the one that just drove you or still bothers you?
When I found examples of corruption in my own country, and that made me sick. And I'm afraid that is why I am rather skeptical when people talk about how well we're better than anybody else. I think we are. However, there is corruption in my country too.
What was the example? What was the electoral corrupt event that bothered you, that you found?
Oh, very easily to describe. They could just fix elections. They can, they can bribe people to vote for them. They can do it in an even more sophisticated way. If you are in charge of who is allowed to vote, it is a clear example of where you can fiddle the system. So the British, because I said the British are I want to say better than others, less bad than others, have got centuries of experience which can be passed on on how to fiddle, the word we use, how to fiddle an election. But in fairness, and I must say, to allow me to go back to my country, and that is, you know, it's far worse. And it's by saying it's far worse, you're talking to somebody who's been everywhere and has seen so much that I am in a very good position to make a judgment of where we would be in a league table. And it changes. Anybody with a knowledge of some countries would see that they were desperately corrupt 20, 30 years ago and are not now, which is the most democratic country in Europe. Mrs. Merkel and her country, which was the most corrupt country in Europe and possibly the world under Nazi Germany. And they were, it wasn't the Germans that kicked them out, it was my country and your country and the British Commonwealth who defeated Nazi Germany. And if ever a country metamorphosized, it's Germany. From the most corrupt country in Europe to being the most honest country led by a woman, I find that spectacular.
The example you gave on Hitler and Germany is an absolute perfect example of when a democracy is just a path to a tyrant's rule. One man, one vote, one time. And we see this more and more. It happened in Egypt under Morsi. It happened in several African countries after independence. One man, one vote, one time. How do you break that cycle without the tremendous investment in military, economic damage and people's lives?
I think the only way is that the public themselves would be fed up with the system. But that's very dangerous, because if they are citizens in an African country or anywhere who wish to challenge the leadership, if the leadership does not want to be challenged, then it could be a bloodbath. There are certainly examples where countries metamorphosize from one to another, but that's rare. I would just hope it will happen in my lifetime, but you know, I'm 73 now, and I don't really think it will. You will have countries changing one way or another, but it's not going to change much.
Before I transition to questions about solutions, what else do you want to say on electoral fraud, what you've seen?
It would take me till Christmas to get beyond the first part of my analysis, because it is simply so enormous. Democracies, genuine democracies, are a minority in this world and will remain so. And even the democracies like the United States, you know, I could spend from now for over a long period to being critical of your political system. I could criticize my own, but not to the extent of the United States, a country I revere. Too much crookedness built into the system. It's always been there. I suspect it will always remain there.
Is the corruption of the electorate a threat to the democracy?
Well, democracy survives in the United States despite the corruption. I think there are just degrees of corruption, and I can't tell you the point at which legitimate corruption, and that's a contradiction of terms, legitimate corruption can reach a certain point where it can remain a democracy, but at some point, it changes from country to country, then that country will move from being, well, a sort of democracy to, a sort of autocracy. And I think it depends on the country. I think it would be a very brilliant person who could create a formula for where people slip into democracy or people slip out of it. Much has been written on it, but I just don't think it's very credible.
Bruce, we've talked a lot about electoral fraud and subverting the process. What do you see are some of the cures? What are some of the things that you see that can make a difference in the future of our elections? Should people be required to provide an ID before they vote?
Yes, of course. Of course they should, and they do. But the crooks in my country, and they're probably not as good as the crooks in your country, would find a way around it because they are smarter and they can hire people who are ostensibly legitimate and ask, how can we get round this? And there are endless, endless ways. I spent a lot of my time before and since I retired where the crookery can begin, how it is implemented, and what the consequences are. But at least in my country, it is still a democracy. At some stage, and I don't think it will ever change, a country can slip over from being, oh well, reasonably democratic to, a little bit authoritarian. And I cannot tell you exactly where that tipping point is. But having spent so much of my career studying and writing on corruption, elections which are corrupt, and all of the subjects I have focused on, all can be brought together into one category of electoral corruption. And it is everywhere. It's a question of degrees of corruption.
Papers versus electronic vote. Do you feel comfortable with electronic voting, voting from your desk at home via email or some type of similar mechanism?
They'll fail. Well, if you're doing it from home and you're corrupt, it's wonderful for you. You can be corrupt from your home without having to go to a polling station and cheat there.
Aren't you worried about the control mechanisms behind an electronic vote?
Whatever control mechanisms a decent country can devise, I can assure you the crooks will find a way around it.
So would you prefer a paper vote over an electronic vote?
It doesn't really matter. If you're going to cheat, you'll cheat.
What about using independent election contractors, someone who's completely independent from the jurisdiction to oversee a vote?
That might sort of work, but it depends on the integrity of the people who have been given the job. Now, you can be, I never earned more. I think the maximum salary I ever earned was $30,000. There are people who wouldn't go down the bloody road for that. So it depends what the levels of integrity are. If somebody thinks it's worthwhile, giving you a fortune, then it'll be very, very difficult to resist. Maybe I've been too contemptuous of my fellow men, and I say men. But I have seen so much in my 50 years or so of studying politics to be other than skeptical about my fellow men.
As an election monitor over the years, what did you find to be the most effective means, and it's a two-part question, for running the election and then auditing the results?
Depends on the country it is being audited. I've done it in my own country and not been entirely happy, because however clever you are, they're smarter than we are. But the key is if the population has a majority of people who are decent, who want to see a good election. If they lose, they lose. Because you know, in a democracy, you can have a chance next election or the one after if you present adequately competent assessments of what you are going to do. But I'm afraid the UK, and I've said many times I'm critical of my own country. When I go to every other country in the world, I puke. I find it unacceptable about world politics, which is generally corrupt. International organizations tend to be much better, but depends on the international organizations. You know, you would think I would be desperately unhappy with all of my perverse views or views on the perversity of politics. No, I'm very happy, very happily married. I know who's the boss in our house. It's not me. So it makes you feel. It doesn't make me feel ill. It doesn't make me feel. It makes me feel ashamed at the world I live in. But at least I can make life easier by saying, yes, there are democracies around the world, and they wish to sustain their democracy, and we should do all we can to try to encourage those countries to be more democratic. But for every time you get a success, you get a failure.
How would you do it if you were going to go back to your old district? Going to go back to your old district. How would you ensure, not yourself running for office, how would you ensure a clean run and then provide for a decent audit of the results?
It's difficult. It might seem a simple question. It's a very difficult question. My former constituency, which I still live in, I love. One prominent member of my party lectured my wife and said, why don't you clear out? Your husband's not in charge anymore. And my wife said, because we love this town and we're never going to leave. And so that's why every 2 weeks in my life, since I retired, London up to Walsall. Now, I'm not suggesting every member of Parliament is in love with his constituency or even former constituency like me. But I think the reason I survived 9 elections, and I'm pretty certain I could have survived a few more, was because I was respected. People may not have been of my political persuasion, but I didn't ask them. When they asked me to help, I didn't ask them, as some members of Parliament do, you know, do you vote for my party or not? I didn't give a damn. And I think people respected me for that. And I said I still have a wonderful reception when my wife and I go back to Walsall. We love the place.
Yeah, but I'm thinking more technically. Procedurally, what would you do to make sure that there was as clean an election as possible? And technically, what would you do to audit or ensure the vote count is authentic?
Well, as I said, however clever you are in creating what you think, or the people who are undertaking that task, there are many things you can do, and it is done, but they still cheat. And it's almost a question of despair. However honest you are as a politician, and there are very many honest politicians, however good you are in running the local authority who is responsible for the organization of the elections, there are rogues around, and the rogues have got money, and the rogues can pervert a system even though the system has a lot of people who are absolutely honest. And I wouldn't be going back to my former constituency if I didn't love it and respect it. But I must say there are things I have seen since I retired, which I'll put it politely, I would not have condoned if I was still a member of Parliament. But then once you leave the job, you're out of it, and people forget you, and you have to move on. So I move on. I think I did make one rather rousing speech in a party meeting when my former assistant was being grossly abused in an organized attack on her, and I went apeshit and did what I promised I would never do. My wife was embarrassed at how, I think I even swore once or twice, which is not unusual in my case. But when your best friend, a woman sitting on her own, surrounded by people hired to cause abuse, then it would not be a man who would have done, would have refused to have done what I did. I'm proud of it. The only thing is I wasn't able to go to the last meeting because I had my commitments here.
Bruce, is more of a final thought. What are your suggestions moving forward to help prevent the corruption and the subversion of the electorate to protect our democracies?
I would first of all say that there will be somebody not as honest as you are who will be doing all they possibly can to undermine men and women of integrity who wish to organize and to run a democratic election. So what you need to do is to look at all of the literature you can possibly find, which will show you where these perverse, evil people will try to undermine what you are doing. The chances are they might be smarter than you are, but you have to try. At least you can go to bed honestly saying, I did my very best, but I failed. There are decent people in every part of the world, and I know those in my country. I know they are decent human beings who hate the concept of electoral corruption, and that's why we don't have too much of it. But I think, I'm not saying we are unique in this sense, but we are in a minority which wants to see honest elections. And if you lose an election, which I never did, well, that's what politics is. It's about winning and losing, and when you lose, you bloody make sure, as best you can, the next time an election comes around, you've got different people, different policies, and your chances of winning increase. That's what democracy is. You win, you lose, you accept defeat, and try your damnedest to make sure it's the other guys who are going to feel the humiliation, not you.
Thank you, Bruce. As I knew you would be very animated in this conversation. And it not only makes it very interesting, it makes it very relevant. Your experiences make this very relevant to the people that are coming behind us and the people that we're going to share this with. I want to thank you from the American Anti-Corruption Institute, Bruce George, myself, and all of us that are trying to make a difference in this world, trying to get rid of corruption one bit at a time. And thank you very much. I'm Elbert Files, President of the American Anti-Corruption Institute, and this is Texas A&M University School of Law.